everybody has a copy, we're in the Lively Encounters chapter, and tonight we're starting on page 78. So this section is an encounter that the Master Hui Neng has with the bhikshu, a monk, an ordained Buddhist monk called Jirdao. It's only actually a few pages, 3.5 pages, but there's no way we're going to get through it tonight, even though it's short, because it's really pithy. It's going into one of the most difficult concepts to get a handle on in this teaching, referred to as Nirvana. And so let's read the first passage through to see what is on the mind of this monk Jirdao when he comes to talk to the Sixth Patriarch, and then we'll just dive in and see how far we can get tonight into Nirvana. I mean, the concept of Nirvana. Okay, it says, the bhikshu Jirdao was a native of Nanhai in Guang province. He asked the master to help him. Since leaving home to become a monk, I've spent more than 10 years studying the Nirvana Sutra, but still haven't grasped its deep meaning. Please, master, help me to understand. The master said, on which point are you unclear? Jirdao answered, all events and activities are impermanent. They arise and perish. When the arising and perishing itself ceases, that very ceasing is bliss. I have doubts about this passage. And the master said, specifically, he's saying, what are your doubts about this passage? So now Jirdao goes into a long explanation of why this has raised doubts in him. By the way, just before we go, that line that he just said, all events are impermanent, they arise and perish, rising and perishing itself ceases, that's bliss. This is a passage from the Nirvana Sutra, so he's quoting the sutra at this point, not something else that he was made up or found someplace else. So it's an actual key line from the Nirvana Sutra. So when he asked, what are your doubts, Jirdao replies, all living beings have two bodies, the physical body and the Dharma body. The physical body is impermanent. It is born and dies. The Dharma body is permanent and has no awareness or consciousness. The sutra says that the very ceasing of birth and death, the ceasing of arising and perishing, is bliss. But I wonder which body ceases and which enjoys the bliss. When the physical body perishes, the four elements scatter. That is total suffering. Such misery cannot be called bliss. If it's the Dharma body that ceases, it would just be like grass and trees, rocks and stones. Who is there to experience the bliss? Moreover, if that wasn't enough, he's going to go on. He's really thought this through, or has pondered it. Moreover, he says, the Dharma nature is the essence, and the five skandhas are the functioning of birth and death. One essence has five functions. So birth and death are permanent, eternal, because birth initiates the functions that go forth from the essence, and at death, the functions withdraw and revert back into the essence. If there is rebirth, then sentient beings never cease to exist and never die. If, on the other hand, there is no rebirth, then sentient beings would simply die out and be forever extinct. The same as inanimate things. Thus, all things would stop with nirvana. And since one does not even get to live, how could there be bliss? Okay, so this is very thorough. He's really thought through all the ramifications, or he thinks he has, but he's in a quandary. He's really paralyzed. And the reason he's paralyzed is very complicated because the words and language of the passage that he read and the words and language of the Nirvana Sutra are trying to point to something that is beyond words and language. This is sometimes called to the finger pointing to the moon. In other words, the finger can point to the moon, but the finger is not the moon. And words and language can direct attention to some understanding and realization, but words and language themselves cannot substitute for that direct realization. And so this has to do with getting into, I would say, the content and the character of the awakening experience of a Buddha. Okay, so this is really what we have to look into. And this is not easy, because if we look at it, and I said one of the better texts to look into this is Ashvaghosha's Buddhacharita, which describes the spiritual quest of the Buddha as he begins addressing questions of everything that he sees around him is impermanent, it's passing, it's fleeting. Therefore, he can't find anything that's solid and substantial that isn't passing and fleeting, including himself. Remember, one of his realizations was this too will pass and fade away. What endures after this is gone? So those questions are very perplexing for him. And since he finds that there is this impermanence and doesn't seem to be anything solid or substantial that's not changing or not in flux, it leads to an angst, a dissatisfaction that's called dukkha, an unsatisfactory state of existence where you know you are alive, but you also know at the same time you are passing and will be gone. And so this notion of where did I come from, where do I go, and what is this brief interval in between is really perplexing. And it's not just, because he was a Buddha, he was a seeker in India at the time. It's a universal concern. There's very few people that don't, at one point or another, look into it or are brought face to face with it. So what the Buddha does, he begins an interesting quest. And instead of going after something, which he starts to seek for things, either in the material sphere of pleasures and whatnot, or in some kind of universal eternal self or soul that he can cling to or whatnot, he quickly, in a very empirical, analytical way, and directly through his own experience, begins to see that everything he picks up, everything he looks to, is in fact impermanent and doesn't have a self nature to its own that's self-existing, but is conditioned depending on everything else. And so what he does in his quest is he instead of seeking for something, he then sets his mind on letting go of what isn't it. If you can get, so everything he's looking at with the idea that he'll find something permanent that'll support the self and so forth. Instead, he just really looks through and says, that's not it. That can't hold. That's not lasting. That's not permanent. This is conditioned and so forth. And he goes through this on his spiritual quest. This is the story of his awakening quest. He goes to teachers, 3 and very prominent teachers, and he attains great states of understanding and insight, and yet the ultimate goal that they present to him, he sees as still marked in a very, very subtle way with a sense of self that isn't real, that gets something that could not be other than conditioned. And so in a very deep, he's got great courage because the temptation, of course, is to grab onto these things that seem a lot better than his palace life and the fleeting pleasures of the world. And there's some real, in the meditation states that he enjoys in this quest, they're really far out. I mean, they're really exquisite. It's not like us sitting on a meditation session for a couple of days and then we go, oh, this hurts, I think I'll go home. No, it's like really enjoyable. But he recognizes in that joy, there's a subtle setting up that he can't rely on. And so he's almost relentless in the pursuit of just saying that's, just poking through. And so finally, when he gets to the place where he just lets go of everything, even the search for awakening itself, he's let go of. He has no desires anymore. There's no more seeking, no more grasping, no more wanting. Right at that point of letting his mind be totally unattached, clinging, wanting nothing, he finds, and that's why the unexpected is said. How unexpected. The same thing happens with Hui Neng. Remember we read earlier, I think in the, let's see, I'm going backwards here, sorry. Do you all remember that line? Yeah, page 15, he says, he too he's got himself to the point where his mind has become unattached, clinging to nothing. And now when he has the experience of hearing the line, which reaffirms what he's just done, in other words, the text says, this is it, and he's had that direct experience, his first words are, how unexpected. So this is the key, I think, we get into. Why is it unexpected? Why is it so unexpected? Like you could say, why doesn't he say eureka? I don't mean California. Eureka, what does eureka mean? Anybody? Yeah, I got it. Yeah. And go out and sell. Why does he say how unexpected? We can't know, but we can surmise a bit. We can surmise a bit.
That it was so simple. It was there all along.
It could be. It wasn't what I expected. It could have been, here I was spending all this time looking there and there and there, and in fact, it was right there in front of me, but I couldn't see it. Could be something like that. It could be unexpected in the sense that in using the word, it wasn't within the realm of expectation, because expectation is in itself a very subtle form of seeking. It's a very subtle form of wanting. And therefore, it comes not from, it's just what I expected, but when I let go of even the expectation of getting it, then something happens. So then he says, basically, the Buddha says, not only is it unexpected, but this capacity to realize this or to experience this is within the reach of every living being. And the only reason we don't get it is not because we don't try hard enough or we don't have good teachers or anything like that. It's actually an internal obstruction rather than external. And the internal obstruction, that's why it's unexpected, because in a sense he was in fact sitting on it. He was in a paradigm paralysis of some sort. And the paradigm shifted somehow when he let go of everything. And instead of being a void he fell into, he entered this wonderful state that he called, Anuttara Samyak Bodhi and Nirvana. Those are the words that are used for it. A perfect awakening, and again, it's interesting, not a perfect acquisition, not even a perfect acceptance, but an awakening. And that's why it's unexpected. It's sort of like, it's almost like you're in a dream and it's really real. I have dreams like that. They're really real. I sweat and it's, and sometimes it's joyful, sometimes it's scary. And then you wake up and you're like, how unexpected. It was just a dream, right? And so it's sort of like that. So when he gets to that place, that internal thing he's talking about were two things. One, what's called deluded or misguided thinking process, and it doesn't mean just cogitation thinking, it means a whole orientation of how we set up and see, how we think we see reality through a certain lens called the self. And that misperception of it through an egocentric mode is one thing that obstructs. And the other thing is grasping and attaching, but they go hand in hand. So because there's this fundamental misunderstanding about the self, and we make it into something, make it into something it isn't, then that self, which we want to be eternal and unchanging and solid, fights against the actual realities that it isn't, and this leads to a nervous anxiety, which is at the heart of desire and seeking from the Buddhist point of view. So desire and seeking from the Buddhist point of view isn't some sort of carnal craving, but rather it's a anxiety-driven search for solidity, for something real to hold on to. It's actually coming more out of anxiety and fear than it is coming out of, say, lust. So this is really important to understand, because the Buddha is saying, once you set up in this paradigm of the self, then you only have two options. It's to seek and grab and try to get something. And on the other hand, also constantly in the back of your mind is a fear that you won't. So that human existence is driven by two very, very strong impulses within, again, I'm using that language, paradigm paralysis, kind of you're stuck in a little web of our own making and only can see the nature of that. One is that you want so badly to have something that's permanent and real, you try to set it up in any way you can. And the Buddha said, in this world, you try to set it up with questing for a immortal body, or endless pleasures, or even oblivion, so that you don't feel anything. And he said, but you'll also quest for it, and you imagine and construct other worlds where you think, yeah, it's not in this world, but when this passes away, some internal I that you imagine as a self or soul, will go off to enjoy an eternal, unmoving, changing sort of self. And he says, this is how it's set up. So it's a questing and longing for some permanent me or my in this time or world, or in the world beyond, or a nihilistic fear that in fact there's nothing whatsoever to any of it, and then you fall into a kind of despair and depression. And these poles are what are at a lot of human activity, one fashion or another. The Buddha would say, even necessarily things that seem to be positive can be driven by this anxiety rather than just the joy of doing them. So many of the things we pursue in terms of our careers or our passions or even our diversions, and even hyper success cannot necessarily be positive in a sense, but overcompensating in a way for this deep sense of lack and anxiety. And so constantly trying to fill it generates most human activity. This is what the Buddha says the root of karma. Actions, intentional actions driven by this vibe of a misunderstanding. Okay, so at this point, the Buddha hesitates to teach, and a lot of people misinterpret this and say, oh, he's so selfish. He got his nirvana, he got his Bodhi enlightenment, and then he did the Gollum thing, my precious, it's mine, and nobody else gets it. It wasn't that, although we do know from the Lotus Sutra that there was this hesitation to teach. Why the hesitation to teach?
Because no one would understand.
Perhaps no one, because maybe no one, what would be the problem with that? I mean, teachers teach all the time and nobody understands it. It doesn't stop them from teaching, right? Huh? Anybody else? Why would he be reluctant? Yes.
I think that you kind of want the person to come up with an understanding themselves versus let them reaching out and something external going out.
So the answer to that was he didn't want to teach because he wanted the maybe potential students to come up with it themselves. So if he gave the answer, then they wouldn't generate the energy to need to quest. That's possible. And in fact, there is a line from the Dhammapada that says, no one liberates you but yourself, no one can, no one may. You yourself must walk the path. Buddha's only show the way. So, but he was reluctant to even show the way. See, this is interesting. He didn't even want to say, I've reached this and announce it. Anybody else?
Would it be that it is understandable that it's really subtle, and it's a subtlety that kind of eludes a lot of people because it's so simple at the same time?
I myself think it's leaning in that direction. Not only is it subtle, it's almost inconceivable. And the reason I say it's inconceivable because the conceiving mechanism of the mind is built around the premise of the self. Therefore, that's why I call it a paradigm. Within the paradigm, there's a self, and as long as that's presumed, then anything outside of what the self could be me or mine can't conceive of. It can fear that doesn't, but that doesn't lead to a constructive quest. It actually leads to a kind of mental anguish and actually a kind of emotional disturbance if you're just driven by fear and anxiety all the time. So I'm saying it's inconceivable only because from the frame of reference of that fundamental issue of the positing of the self, there's only various ways to see it, and it can't be actually conceived of. He didn't conceive of it. It's really interesting. That's why he says, how unexpected. If he had thought about it, he said, conceived it, I was right. But he wasn't saying I was right. He was saying, whoa, how unexpected. In other words, the only way he got at it was stopping conceiving, stopping expecting, and then it happened. Now, it took, I guess, incredible courage and patience to do this. And then, I don't know, it's like, I don't know the state of nirvana, but as it's described, to actually see through and let go of everything whatsoever and not fall into despair. Whoa. Yes?
I have sort of a heretical suggestion to add to the rest, which is, with 20/20 hindsight, we know that the Buddha was able to maintain the awakened state throughout his life. But he was the first one doing it, and he didn't know he'd be able to do that. So I would wonder whether at some level he thought, man, if I'm out there teaching, power corrupts, and I may start to get dragged back into the world of
Okay. So this comment was, I got it, but if I go back in the world, I'll lose it. Right? and,
part of the problem, not the solution.
and who would he lose it to exactly?
Well, no, I'm not saying he would lose it.
He'd be corrupted again. Power would corrupt, as you say.
Yeah.
Temptation would corrupt
And
again.
it wouldn't be helping anybody.
Right. The texts themselves explain, especially if you look at the last sort of temptations he went through, he burned through it. He really burned through it. Anything that was possible to move or attract him both internally and externally, he had completely seen through. His reluctance wasn't so much that he would be pulled back, but that he could not find a way to present this to people that they could actually pick it up, because it's so outside the realm of where most people are at. In other words, to say there is no self and there's nothing to get, which was his realization, which brought him, apparently, the text to say at this point, he experienced a joy beyond joy, a bliss beyond bliss, a liberation beyond the wildest liberation one can imagine. And it was a marker of a total purity, a total wholeness, without anything needed to be added. Purity, there was a sense of this was a permanent, unchanging realization that there was a true self that was manifest in this, and then there was this incredible joy. Those were the four markers that were said to associate it with this. So he was very, if you could say, he was very satisfied there. You could say there's no reason. But at the same time, if we look back, one of the motivating factors for his quest was an innate sense of compassion that he saw animals and people and everything in the world suffering and in pain and going through aging, sickness, and death. And so he said in his quest, it wasn't just for him to solve this, but hopefully solve it in such a way that he could share it with others. So the compassion was one of the driving forces. So this is why it's kind of strange. He's reluctant at this point to follow through. And my best guess is that it is indeed, he couldn't think of a way to present this that could be even palatable. But then in the text, and I didn't bring it tonight, I wasn't going to read you, there's a great passage in the Lotus Sutra where he's pondering this, and suddenly he comes up and he realizes this idea of upaya, or expedient means. And he realizes that this is how the Buddhas, when they become Buddhas, actually begin their teaching. Not with the direct truth, because it's just way too hard. So psychologically, they use what's called shaping. They break it down into smaller and smaller steps, progressive stages. And therefore, he had a mechanism now where he could go out and he said, I can shape this down to various steps. So people let go of something and they feel a corresponding liberation and joy, and then I can encourage them to let go of something else, and so on and so forth, till they go through various stages, not only of utter confusion, but increasing stages of awakening and joy and whatnot, and moving them right along. So that's how his teaching career begins then with this development of upaya. Okay. So the biggest challenge he has is how to inspire and encourage people to, as the texts say, to leave the dust and go back to the root and source of to leave what's false. And remember, we read that wonderful parable of the burning house? The children with their toys in the burning house, and the elders coming, and he can't get them out of the burning house. This is the quandary the Buddha faces. The burning house can be really miserable, but it also can be a condo that's really nice. You know, we all have the toys, so to speak, and the toys are not just things we play with, but they're ideas we entertain that reify the paradigm of the self and so forth. So we live in this cocoon of a burning house, so to speak. And so the elder comes up with expedient devices, right? The carts and the toys, and says the kids gradually come out. So this is what the Buddha's doing, but he's realizing that this imaginary construct that we've set up of the self is really, really hard to break through. And so gradually go at it. Nonetheless, as it gets closer and closer and people understand this idea of nirvana, they're pushing him to explain, what is nirvana? What is the state? What is your state, Buddha? And my state is nirvana. And they say, well, can we get it? And he says, no, because it can't be got. And this is where we're going here, because from the ordinary mind that's in that paradigm, it wants it. You see, and so he can't say, but he can't say that. He can't say, no, you can't get it. Because then they'll fall into despair, so why try? So he says, yes, you can. But, you know, and so there's this back and forth where the Buddha is always trying to steer between encouraging and stimulating and supporting his disciples and students to begin the process of breaking down these attachments, at the same time careful not to speak of it ultimately, because it would scare them to say there isn't anything, because that would break the expedient. Only when he realized it did he say how unexpected, and was happy with that there wasn't anything to get. In fact, it was liberating. But until that there's that direct experience, it's really hard. So the concept of nirvana always seems to play out between two extremes. One is that it's this eternal, divine, heavenly state that's permanent, unchanging, and you go to and you enjoy, or it's utter extinction, utter annihilation, and there's nothing whatsoever. And this is where, in the Nirvana Sutra, Jirdao's coming up with his questions. We okay so far? I mean, probably you have questions, but we'll keep going. So let me just say, so in the Nirvana Sutra, there's an actual, the closest description you're going to get in words and language to what nirvana is or is not. And don't go in thinking, good, I get this dumb lecture that Marty's giving, I get past, I'm going to go home and read that Nirvana Sutra and get what it is. It's not quite that simple, because the Nirvana Sutra is more like still playing with the tension between these two extremes. So one, the Nirvana Sutra says that this final state that the Buddha reached is not annihilation, but it's an unending, joyous state. So this is the first thing it's affirming, that it isn't annihilation, it isn't extinction. The second thing the sutra is saying is it's not unique to sages and Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, but is the innate capacity or potential of any living being. So one, it's saying it's not annihilation, it's an incredible joy and liberation. Secondly, it's not limited to divine beings or blessed beings or special people. It's within the capacity of everybody. And not only is it the potential for Buddhahood there, but this is the important line, it is in fact identical with the final nature of reality. So the final nature of reality is nirvana and Buddhahood, but it's not an ending. And this removes the negative connotations of emptiness. Because what emptiness then means here is a wondrous existence. It's not an end, but an entry into a liberated, unbound, unattached, full, complete state. And then the last part is, even though there's no self, the Buddha said, in the way we normally think about it or want it to be, there isn't nothing whatsoever. There is, and sometimes the text uses this as an expedient term, a true self beyond the conditioned or conventional notions we have of ourselves. Now, the Buddha is only using this term to keep people from falling into a nihilistic view to think there's nothing. But you see now with Jerdao, he's caught on the horns of this dilemma. Because he's saying, if there's no self, then who gets the bliss? You see, and if nirvana is nothingness, then how is it different than just extinction? So he's caught here, and now it's the Sixth Patriarch that has to answer him. So, where do we go? Well, let me do something first. I want to do I think it's, the thing I like about this passage is, when I was doing my research earlier, I thought that this notion of nirvana was really hard to grasp because of my Western framework. That I come from a Judeo-Christian background, I come through the Western classics and Western science and technology. Although I've had spiritual blah, 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 I have a basic, materialistic construction of the nature of how things are, empirical, rational, and so forth. And the idea of no self or no eternal blah, is just not within my frame. And so I thought, when I looked at the history of this concept of nirvana as it came into the West, boy, it's a real snare. I mean, it's just really threw Westerners for a loop. Big time. And and the thing I like about this passage is I realize here's Jerdao, who's Chinese in the Tang Dynasty, and he's wrestling with it too. So it's not just a Western construct that makes this difficult to grasp. It might be something even more deeply, universally psychological. But I'll share with you some of the... Okay, so what does nirvana mean? I mean, that's probably the first thing to get at. Anybody? Definition of nirvana? Nothingness? Paradise? I have, yes.
Well,
It's not the band. Okay.
and mostly more familiar with like all does it mean awake?
A what?
Awake?
Hmm.
Nirvana.
Bodhi.
Okay.
Bodhi means awake. Thus, Buddha means awakened one. Nirvana actually, how do we do this? Okay. Nir means flame. Nir of nirvana means flame. And the va can be translated one way is to blow out. Okay? But ver also can mean to extinguish either by blowing out or starving the fuel, smother or cover over. So it's very interesting. Flame, either blown out or smothered over. And so it can mean that it's something that you blow out and extinguish, or you starve it of fuel and let it embers die down by itself. So it can be something that's rather sudden or something that happens in a slow time. But what is it blowing out? What is it smothering and covering over? Because the early translators then took this, they translated nirvana as extinguish, extinction. And then when the Buddha said, I will not construct this house anymore, I will not be reborn, meaning involuntarily, He didn't mean that existence ceases. He meant that existence in the conditioned way ceases to be a problem. But that was very subtle. What they just had was a Sanskrit, and they translated it as extinction, and that quickly led to,
Nihilism?
yeah, that to be a Buddha is to basically go out and not come back. So, the early translators, and I'll read you some of this because it's all full of rhetoric of negation and pessimism. Now, there was another reason that it was rendered this way, because a lot of the early translators were coming from Christian missionary stances and wanted to represent this as something that needed really quick attention, because we had the lemmings going over the cliff. The Buddhists are all going to extinction. So I'll read you one. This is from an early translator. In Buddhism, there is neither God nor heaven, neither prayer nor pardon, neither faith nor providence, neither resurrection nor future. It is without one ray of light or gleam of hope from the beginning to end. No. I mean, this is how, if you read the text and said utter nirvana, and they took to be utter nothingness as the goal, he finishes, he says, the purest and holiest affections wither at its touch. For with nirvana, personal consciousness ends, and when consciousness ends, all love passes away. Now that sounds warm and cuddly. No, it doesn't. But that's one of the first takes on this. And even somewhat scholarly sympathetic translations. Now you remember, none of them are really encountering any Buddhists. They're just getting this from translations of the text. Sometimes in French, sometimes in German. Not quite, and early on some English coming in. This is one that a lot of people referred to at the time as the Dictionary of Buddhism, and it said, Buddhism is essentially a religion of sullen despair, based on the total obliteration of a healthy faith in the actual constitution of things. So it wasn't even saying a healthy faith in God or divine, in the constitution of things. It was not having faith in the substantiality of the material world. All conditioned dharmas are like dreams, illusions, bubble shadows. Whoa, right? So this was some of it. Even, let's say this held for a long time, and I must say, this isn't necessarily gone. Some of you may, in fact, not here necessarily, but you may encounter sentiments like this, even today, where you go, if you go home, you go to visit someplace else, and you say, well, I'm a Buddhist. Oh, I'm so sorry. You have nothing to look forward to. Oh, you're looking forward to nothing. But it's sort of like, that's still a dominant impression. And even people who say, well, it may be about something that's personally liberating, it's socially apathetic and not engaged and doesn't care about anything else. Just get my nirvana and that's it. So there's a lot of continuing misconceptions essentially around this term. But at the same time, there were other people who started to look at it more closely, and I'll say this, very interesting. Some of them actually then had face-to-face encounters with actual Buddhists. Either those who came early to the United States, or they themselves went on travels and got beyond the books to actually encounter Buddhist faith, face-to-face. And now they were in a quandary, because they didn't see the sullen despair, hopelessness, but they saw these really kind of energetic, bright, happy people, totally engaged in life, cultivating meditation and all these things, and trying to figure out, why are they bothering if all they want to do is go extinct? It doesn't make sense. So one person said, the reason I like Buddhism is because it doesn't fit my expectations. Only that reason. It's like, it's very strange. It's like a fairyland. And I find it really entertaining and amusing because it challenges my conceptions from a Western mind. And this was one of the first really more sympathetic translators who had the first chair of Sanskrit at Harvard at the turn of the century. I'll read you his quote because it's really nice. He says, the large part of the pleasure that I have experienced in the study of Buddhism has arisen from what I may call the strangeness of the intellectual landscape. All the ideas, modes of argument, even the postulates assumed, are not argued about, have always seemed so strange, so different from anything to which I've been accustomed, that I felt all the time as though walking in fairyland. Much of the charm of Oriental thoughts and ideas have for me appears to be because they seldom fit into Western categories. So he was ready to have his ideas shaken and challenged, and it was curious to him. But it wasn't negative. It wasn't negative. So the person who was really instrumental in giving the negativity was a famous scholar called Max Mueller. Some of you know about Max Mueller? You're nodding, do you? What about Max Mueller?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, everybody,
Unless you were just nodding asleep. That's okay. I didn't mean to wake you up.
everybody know about him, about his translations this whole.
Mm-hmm.
I have encountered later who is.
He was a German scholar, middle of the 19th century, many languages under his belt, and the Sacred Books of the East was his project. So you'll still see that as one of the standard collections of Buddhist and Hindu thought, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Buddhist Sutras, even the Mahayana Sutras, in the Sacred Books of the East. That was his challenge. And he was the one, when he first encountered the terms, just said, utter nothingness. This is just about utter nothingness. But then, because he was a scholar like that, various monks and scholars from the East came to visit him, and he'd have them for tea and cookies and the whole thing, expecting to be like, kind of at an early funeral. It would just be, and it turned out that these guys and these men and women were really interesting. They were bright, they were educated, they could talk his philosophy, and he couldn't put it together. And then when he made his trip, he saw the ordinary people. And it wasn't just the monks and nuns and the scholars, but ordinary people were also pretty charged up and happy. And he said, this doesn't make sense. So instead of concluding that Nirvana was positive, he wasn't willing to go that far. He said, this is a mystery. So let me read you his line. After all of this, and he gets excited, and you could see this in his correspondence, his notes. He said, I met a Buddhist monk today, and so forth, and I was utterly surprised how pleasant and upbeat and joyful and cheerful he was, and not dumb, Wow, this doesn't make sense. So he says, how a religion which taught the annihilation of all existence, of all thought, of all individuality, and the annihilation of personality as the highest object of all endeavors, how that could have laid hold of the minds of millions of human beings is a riddle which no one has been able to solve. So that's as far as he would go at that point. This is a riddle. How is it that these are the goals? And so what he was doing was taking this very narrow translation of Nirvana and then asking, how could millions of people be sucked in by this? How could they make this their goal? And what's more, he couldn't figure out why they didn't just immediately kill themselves to go off to Nirvana. But, this was the beginning of a very difficult back and forth. Even Carl Jung, because he encountered early on in his life just the early works like Mueller did, he had a reaction that said, how can this be? This is, his words was, a radical denial of life and existence. Because when he encountered this. Now, of course, later, as he got into this more, he actually did 180 degrees and became a proponent and cultivator in some ways, in his own way, of this. But his first reaction was to encounter this. So all I'm trying to do to point out tonight a little bit is to say, this is coming from, of course, if you want to say Western or whatever, difficulty in bridging this, but Zhidao is also pointing out that this isn't just Western. Zhidao is a Tang Dynasty Chinese monk. And, Max Mueller could read what he has to say and say, that's right on. He said exactly what I was thinking, okay? So fortunately and unfortunately, we don't get to hear the answer tonight. But you can just look at the first line and realize the Sixth Patriarch is not going to pass him on his thesis. He's going to say, you are a disciple of the Buddha. How can you use the perverse and heretical views of nihilism and eternalism to discuss the supreme vehicle teachings? So immediately his response is, you have fallen into a real upside down state. But what's going to be interesting to us as we get into this is how does he untie this for him? Because I must say, if you're a reasonable, rational person and you start with some of these premises, you could easily ask these questions. People have. People in this room have, are, or will eventually come to this. If there's nothing and no self, who gets reborn? Who gets nirvana? Or on the other side, if there's no self and nothing that belongs to self, where does karma reside? There's no place for karma. You know, so these are the questions that sometimes people ask. Don't go away thinking there's no answers, but like Jirdao, the implications of what he's asking is not just philosophical, it's actually deeply existential and moral. You know, that's why this is a really important passage, and we ran out of time tonight to go into it. But next week we'll pick it up again. Which is to say, I have to either apologize or give you good news. I won't be here next Friday. So depending on your point of reference, I see some faces are smiling, so that's okay. Our dear friend, colleague, Henry Rosemont, you know, passed away this summer while I was there in Newport, and now there's going to be this coming weekend a memorial gathering for him. And so the family invited me to come, and I will. There's nothing you do. You go and be present, but it's a way to honor him and to also maybe in some way give some consolation to the family. I think the family takes great consolation in the fact that many people are coming who have been touched by him. That, in other words, they can see that his legacy is still going in the people that he taught and touched. And that's an important thing to feel, because a sense of loss, especially for his wife and children, they lost their husband and father. But when they see so many people that have been touched by, they can feel like there's some buoyant light of meaning coming from that. And they actually can feel in a funny way that he's not completely gone. He lives on in this. So by going and being there, maybe say a few words or something, this really takes that down. Same thing happened to my mother when my younger sister died. She was very, very much in despair and didn't want to do anything and forced herself to go to the funeral. But when she went to the funeral and she was, you know, sitting down in the receiving line, all these people came that had known and said, your daughter was wonderful, da-da-da. The children and grandchildren were all there. And suddenly she felt a bit of, you know, of that life carries on through a web rather than just individuals. And that pulled her out of the despair. And I knew she was in despair because she wasn't eating. If you knew my mother, she eats. Morning, lunch, and dinner. Never misses. Only in utter despair would she miss a meal. So she missed a meal and I got really worried. But right after that, she picked up again and started eating. So anyways, I won't be here next because I'll fly out on Friday, come back on Sunday. But the class will go on. We'll still have it. Stacy has volunteered. Eagerly volunteered to continue the class. Stacy and Jin Chuan and I are teaching this text this semester as co-teachers at the Buddhist University class. We're doing the Platform Sutra in depth. But also, she did her master's thesis on this text. So all the difficult questions you want to ask, don't ask me, you can ask her. So we'll meet again next week. Any announcements? The group left for Europe today, so Heng Shi and Jin Hui are left for Europe on a tour. So what's happening while everybody's gone?
There's a first course session
Huh?
starting this weekend at CDC.
Okay.
4 recitations
First store recitation session starting this week at CPD.
That goes out to other people, but nobody in the room will hear it.
Oh.
Yeah.
Do I need to solve
You don't
it?
even have to do that, because now the people online are.
I don't think either. So Earth Store session on starting Saturday for 1 week. I think all the regular classes here are going on. Buddhism for the Modern Mind.
No,
Are we still doing 25th? Are they going to be IWR office?
Yeah.
So on September 25th, we have Buddhism for the Modern Mind with Doug. He's doing a class using a French feminist philosopher, Irigaray, and Nagarjuna and Bodhisattva. And it's kind of similar to this theme that we did over the summer on Sudaner Center. And kind of looking at how we, you could say, kind of talking about ideology and framings, is how do we see through the kind of modern ideologies that have come about. His tagline, the starting line, is something like, why is everyone angry? Why are we?
Why all the anger?
Why all the
Everyone's so
anger?
right.
Yeah, and then the second line is.
Everyone's so,
No, the second line is. What's the second line?
Yes, why
Why all the anger?
everyone's so right.
And why is everyone so right? Or why am I so right?
You know
When everyone is right. Yeah.
So right.
Whenever it's so right, something like that.
ah.
So yeah. Anyways, welcome to come.
Is there anger in the air? I didn't notice.
No, it's a tease. It's a
Now I'm
small
gonna see it
tease.
everywhere.
Small tease. So anyways, that'll be actually, because we'll have a Dharma Master coming to speak on the Pure Land tradition here. He'll be speaking here September 25th in the Buddha Hall, I think starting at 7.
That's Monday night.
That's also
So
Monday
there's
night.
two things going on
Yeah,
Monday night.
September 25th. This is 2 weeks from now. And also we have Amelia's class on yoga in the dining hall. So Doug will be moving across the street on the Institute for World Religions office. So if people are interested, please come.
What about on Saturday night now?
Yeah, Saturday we have our regular sutra lectures. We're lecturing on the Sutra on Infinite Life, Amitabha Buddha's kind of life story. We've mostly just been telling stories about the early Buddhist disciples. So we're still in the version, still on the first page after 2 years.
So storytelling. Really?
We move fast.
Really?
We got like one disciple a lecture.
Now you know
So
where I
it
get my
goes-
inspiration.
The already goes fast compared to
Well, we're on the first page.
We're maybe 2/3 through, I think. 2/3 through. Well, last week was very interesting. We talked about one of the arhants who were in the assembly.
Those are just
Actually-
statues, by the way.
Yeah, there's arhats and the statues in there. And actually, we talked about one of the images in here. I never knew that. So, anyways.
Are
Okay, so that's-
s'mores, you have s'mores of the stories or no s'mores?
No s'mores, no
Okay.
s'mores. But you can come for lunch on Saturday.
Yeah, that's a good lunch on Saturday, vegetarian.
Yeah,
Anything else? That's about it.
I think that's it.
If you want to get kind of updates all the time, there must be a way to go online, right, Locke? Or is there a website you go to? Is it BBM or DRBA or what?
BerkeleyMonastery.org. And if you want to
Okay.
be on a mailing list, I think you're probably going to talk to Locke, I guess. I know Alan usually
That's
does it.
Locke, by the way. There's a
He's
voice
not
behind the
here.
box there. And
Yeah.
yeah, if you would like to get on a mailing list so you know the events are
Also,
coming up.
Fab,
Or
have you announced your yoga class last week, or people know about that?
I wasn't here last week.
Oh, you wanted to say something about that? Yeah, you want? You can pass the
People online are not going to be able to come.
microphone. You never know. You never know. They might be watching from home.
So 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. on Mondays and Thursdays, I'm teaching yoga in the dining hall here. Everybody's welcome. Depending on who shows up, that's how I will teach. So concentrating on just opening up your hips, not just going through postures for the sake of going through postures, because there's nothing magical in the postures themselves other than working with your body to release tension, restore mobility so that you can sit more comfortably. That's kind of at the baseline. There's a lot more to yoga, but that's what we're kind of working with. Stabilizing the body so that you can sit more comfortably in meditation to stabilize the mind. And
Yoga.
also, in terms of getting the message out there, I just created an Instagram feed. So if you're on Instagram, at Berkeley Monastery, I'm trying to post every day about what's happening. It'll be a good way to get the word out in terms of cancellations, changes in programs as well.
it's interesting. We were just talking about the state of awakening comes with the letting go. And when everything is let go of, then there's that. So letting go of anger, letting go of tension. It's very interesting. You know, it's just like all of the practices are not about getting, but untying, letting go, relaxing. Actually, Nirvana means the flame going out, which means chilled. Chilled. So chill out, okay? We'll do the transference. We've been doing the May Every Living Be.
May every living
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every living, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace, with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the three jewels.